Welcome to Journalist Roundtable. I'm Larry Casper. Our guests are Dennis Owens from WHTM ABC 27 in Harrisburg, Tom Riese from WESA, and Katie Meyer from Spotlight PA. Katie, we'll start with you. How much does Governor Shapiro propose to spend in his new state budget proposal?
So he is proposing, his number is $51.4 billion. That's about an 8% increase over the enacted budget from that we're currently operating under. And I should say, I mean, there are always sort of differences of opinion when it comes to how much revenue we can actually expect from these budgets, how much everything is actually going to cost. Republicans think he's, for instance, far overestimating the revenue he's going to bring in, underestimating some of the spending. So you're going to hear differences of opinion on a lot of those numbers. But that's the kind of long and short of it. And kind of to contextualize the state's, fiscal position, and we can talk about this. I'm sure others have stuff to say about it as well. But we do operate under a structural deficit here in Pennsylvania. That's not new. It's been going on for decades at this point. Basically, we just spend more every year than we take in. And so what that often leads to is us kind of scrambling to fill in the gaps. We have a surplus right now, a budget surplus, as well as a pretty healthy rainy day fund. But at this rate of spending, we are going to have to dip into those. So that's, the broad strokes.
Go ahead, Dennis.
Well, Republicans will tell you that it's not only dipping into it, it is exhausting completely within a fiscal year the surplus, and will then dip into the rainy day fund, which is roughly $7.8 billion. It would spend $1.5 billion of that. The other concern that I hear is that it's the first time in Pennsylvania history a governor's proposing north of $50 billion in a budget. And the issue there is once you get there, what then next year and the year after that? Because that seems to set the floor for the following year. Because it's very rare. I'd have to go back and look, but it's very rare that a budget goes backwards year to year. So that's setting the floor for the next year. And Republicans are arguing that's unsustainable. They got so flush with cash in large part because of federal stimulus dollars during the pandemic and all of that. But that money is now drying up.
Tom, as far as you can tell, how is Pennsylvania's overall financial health right now?
Like Dennis mentioned, Republicans have definitely mentioned that we could deplete this rainy day savings fund. I think someone told me that, a regular amount to draw from that would be 10 to 15% of it. But Shapiro would be proposing to take a little bit more than that to fund some of the initiatives here. Some of the Republican leaders also said that's because of a huge push to fund human services programs. So I think, the budget hearings in the next few months obviously talk about that a lot more in depth.
Katie, let's go back to you. Now the governor has ideas for revenue that we've already acknowledged here. So let's talk about legalizing marijuana. What's his reasoning here? Why does he want to do that, Katie?
Sure. Well, actually, I just want a little point of context right before we get into that,
Sure.
And then I'll absolutely discuss marijuana. I'll just say there are a couple of really strong cost drivers with this, and there's a reason why we see, as Dennis mentioned, year over year increases in state spending. There are mandatory pieces of spending that the state has to do. So, for instance, mandatory Medicaid costs. There are federal programs we simply have to spend money on. And there's very little that the state can really do other than drastic cuts to get around that. And we also, and we'll talk about this more later, but we're under this court ruling that mandates that we fix our education system, which was very badly underfunded for many years. And again, we'll talk more about that. But yeah, that leads to a revenue conversation, which is another sort of crucial piece of the puzzle here for Josh Shapiro, who's trying to find ways to patch some of those gaps. So recreational marijuana is one of them. We already have medical marijuana in the state. I guess, Larry, to your question, the biggest reason that I've heard from a lot of lawmakers is just that we are now an outlier. Half of states in the country have legalized it at this point. All of the surrounding states to us, except for West Virginia, have. So a lot of Pennsylvanians are already buying recreational marijuana across the border in New Jersey, in New York. And, the argument that I hear most often is that we're just losing out on revenue from that. And so there's a couple different ways that lawmakers could legalize this. There's also a lot of roadblocks. One of the roadblocks is just that lack of unity over how it would happen among the supporters. Some people want state stores like we have for alcohol. Some people want medical sellers to be able to expand. And then you do have the holdouts, especially in the Senate. Republicans are in charge of that chamber. They have always been skeptical of this in concept. And so I think it'll be a big lift. There's no consensus about doing it, just as there hasn't been for many years. But I do think that sort of pressing need for revenue might be a little bit of a driver.
Now, Dennis, according to the governor, just how much revenue can recreational marijuana bring in?
A couple $100 million. Have 390 some on the licensing alone, I believe is what his budget estimate had, his budget booklet this time. To Katie's point, when they're flush with cash, they have surpluses and rainy day funds. Maybe you don't have to make as tough of decisions. But when all of a sudden the economics aren't great, then you have to look at revenue. And I know the argument would be it beats raising income taxes or sales taxes, and it's people choosing to do it. And as Josh Shapiro said the other day, he's talked to folks who sell it in neighboring states, and they say 60 or 70% of our customers are coming from Pennsylvania. So he said we might as well be cashing in on that. It reminds me exactly of the argument Ed Rendell used to make when he wanted casinos in Pennsylvania, saying, I'm watching all those folks take buses down to Atlantic City. Why aren't we keeping them in Pennsylvania? It's almost exactly the same argument. And as Katie said, the need for money is going to be a little more of an aggressive driver of it.
So if recreational marijuana is currently off the legal radar anyway, how can we make an estimate as to how much revenue could come in?
Well, you raise a very astute point, my friend, and I'm seeing all kinds of estimates on how much this, that, or the other are going to bring in. And let's be honest, a lot of times they're pulling that out of thin air. Same thing with skills games, which I'm sure we're going to talk about as well. There's numbers being pulled out of thin air as to how many machines there are or how much money it would bring in. But there's no question there's a market for it and it would bring in some money. There's no question gambling in the casinos, whatever it is they estimated, they're doing great because casinos, people are spending $500 million a month in casinos. Another $500 million a month on the lottery.
Tom, are Pennsylvania lawmakers ready to embrace the legalization of marijuana?
I know many Democrats are. There are some Senate Republicans. I believe Dan Laughlin from Erie has introduced a bill. Someone that I spoke with earlier this week say the federal designation, not legalizing marijuana, is one of the big considerations, saying why do we need to get involved in this ahead of the federal government? But as Katie mentioned, I think there's 24 states that have done so already, and I don't think there's been some huge crackdown that would have been coming from the federal government. And a lot of states are already happy that the revenue is bolstered by that industry. So I'm not sure if this is the year for it. I think Spotlight actually had a good story that came out. I forget if that was yesterday or today, saying the appetite still might not be there despite the public attitudes around adult use cannabis being there.
So let's go back to you,
Yeah.
Katie. If you figure there are obstacles on the way to legalizing recreational marijuana, what are they?
Yeah, so shout out to my colleague Kate Huangpu, who's been covering this pretty closely. She's the one who did that story for us the other day. But yeah, I mean, basically, it's two things. As Tom mentioned, I would say the bigger challenge is that Senate Republicans have never committed to the fundamental idea of legalization. There's a couple things that they're concerned about. One of them is the fact that it's still, I think it's a Schedule I drug federally. It's technically illegal. So they don't want to do that. There are, safety concerns. People are worried about drug driving, that kind of thing. And so Senate leadership is just still not totally on board with the idea. That could be softening. But then the other challenge is just what's the mechanism going to be? So I mentioned before, some people want state stores like we have for alcohol. Some people want these very large multi-state corporations who already sell medical drugs in Pennsylvania. They want them to be able to expand. And then there's a concern that it's going to get too corporatized. Small sellers won't be able to get into it. There's also challenges about how to do sort of social equity components to this. A lot of Democrats want there to be people to be, have their records wiped who were already put into jail for selling small amounts of weed because, if it's legal now, you suffered for it for years when it wasn't. And so we need to make that right if we're going to change the law. That's the idea anyway. So all of these components of the law, that's going to be a debate. And there hasn't been a unified proposal from either chamber yet. The House, I think, is getting a little bit closer. Dan Frankel, who leads a key committee there, he's been working on a bill. We don't have the full language, but I think his goal is to kind of straddle the divide, try to kind of create some consensus in the House. As far as the Senate goes, Tom mentioned Dan Laughlin. He also chairs a very key committee and has been in favor of it, has is sponsoring one of these bills. So I would say there's movement toward it. We just don't know if it's going to be enough yet.
So Dennis, how about this? Republicans are reacting to this by saying that the governor's taking kind of an attitude that I would summarize as putting the cart before the horse. In other words, counting on revenue for something that's not legal yet.
Well, they say that, and they also say he vastly overestimates how much money it will bring in. To Katie's point in all of this, and as we talk about skills games, the devil is in the details. Governor Shapiro loves to say, hey, we're moving at the speed of business. But the building he's working in and the legislature moves at the speed of glaciers. They can't, but there are some thorny issues. But to the same point, we've been talking about recreational marijuana now for several years. We've been talking about skills games, which have proliferated across the Commonwealth for several years. Nothing seems to move quickly there. I'm also interested, and this isn't part of your line of questioning, but I am watching. It's no secret that Josh Shapiro may have higher aspirations in running for president. This is a big year because next year's the governor, I'm wondering if there isn't some calculus in the Republican side of the building to say we don't want to give him too many victories either. Because if he has lots of victories, goes on to an easy re-elect for governor, that's propping him up on that. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some thoughts that way as well.
So let's talk some more about the potential of so-called skill games for generating revenue here in Pennsylvania. Give me a quick review on what they are. Dennis, I know they're in pizza joints, they're in convenience stores, they're in social clubs.
Laundromats,
So
a
what are
Burger
these
King
things?
near
Yeah, what
near
are
the
these
farm show
things?
in Harrisburg.
They resemble slot machines.
Yeah, they're called Pennsylvania Skills. You may see them when you go into convenience stores. There's usually stools, and they're these slot machine-like machines, devices. You put money in, you try to win money. There's apparently a skill connected to it. I clearly don't have that skill because I lost $10 in 7 seconds and don't even know what happened. So, but some people, I'm told, have the skill. And they've been ruled skills games, not slot machines, which is why legally they've been able to go into a limbo land. That is, nobody's saying you're illegal because they're saying we're not slot machines. And they've proliferated all across the Commonwealth. The governor in his budget estimated there are 70,000 of these machines out there right now. But I don't know how we really get our arms around that completely. There is a bill, Gene Yaw, Republican senator. Now, if Republicans are all against the vices, well, Gene Yaw is the biggest cheerleader for these because they are manufactured in his district. He's proposed a bill that would tax them at 16%, which he says is what casino table games are. Most people in the building laugh out loud at that because casino slot machines are taxed at 54%. The governor proposed they'd be taxed at 52%, with 5% of that going to the lottery, which he says cannibalizes, those machines cannibalize the lottery and senior programs. So that was what he did. Now, Gene Yaw scoffs at that, saying that's too high. And if it's 52%, you might as well not bother because they'll all be out of business. That's what he says. These are mostly machines in smaller clubs, pizza shops, VFWs, Legions, Elks, couple of machines typically. And those, we should be clear, there's some great benefits to those business owners that do them. Some of them have told me, I give my employees health insurance because of the money I generate. Or some of the Elks or VFWs were able to sponsor a number of things in the community because of those extra dollars we bring in. But the bottom line is, every day there's been inaction on this, and there's been inaction for years now. Somebody out there is making millions of dollars. The state is not. And the state doesn't really like that. But again, the devil's in the details, similar to what she's saying about marijuana. Where are they going to be? Are they going to only be in places where there's liquor licenses? Or are they going to be in laundromats? What's the tax rate? 16% as y'all wants, 52% as the governor wants, somewhere in between? Don't know. And where's the oversight? So the governor's proposing the Gaming Control Board. It has gaming control in its name. They oversee the casinos. The governor, most people want that. Gene Yaw, they're a little mistrustful of the Gaming Control Board, and they want it to go to the Department of Revenue, a la the Pennsylvania Lottery.
So, Katie, we have untold thousands of these so-called skill games all over Pennsylvania.
We do indeed. And yeah, I think to Dennis's point, the issue isn't necessarily whether we should tax and regulate them. There's been this kind of growing consensus that we should. Even the skill games operators say, yeah, we would like to be operating under the law. We don't want to be in this legal gray area anymore. For years, they had an issue with their machines being seized because they were there was a question of whether they were technically illegal or not. There's been a court ruling. They're kind of out of that woods now. But anyway, the big question is very political, and it has to do with a lot of very powerful, well-moneyed interests. The casinos have a very strong lobby in Harrisburg. They spend a ton of money on good lobbyists. And, that means that they are very strongly pushing the skill games to not cut into their own profit margin. They want them taxed at the same rate as their own slot machines are. The skill game lobby is also, doing pretty well. And they also have kind of ears that are theirs in the building, and they want a much lower tax rate. So the tax rate is the big thing, but also, yeah, as Dennis said, where they're going to be allowed to be. VGTs are another sector of sort of gaming in Pennsylvania. Those are video game terminals. Those are right now only allowed to be in truck stops, and they have their own lobby, and they want restrictions on where these skill games can be. So it's a really tangled issue, and it doesn't break down neatly along party lines. You'll kind of see, people, for instance, who have a casino in their district are generally more on the casino line. As Dennis said, Gene Yaw, he represents a district where skill game operators are based. He is very much on that side of the debate. There are people in both parties who fall into those categories. So it's complicated. They really want the revenue. They want to get these things regulated. It's hard to do it.
Tom, do you suppose this will be a priority for lawmakers in the coming weeks? How much emphasis are lawmakers ready to put on skill games?
Well, as Dennis mentioned, I think someone told me that this has been a discussion for maybe over 10 years now. I think some people who are for it, and as Katie mentioned, that could go across the aisles here on either party, hope to see them taxed, whether that's between 13 to 54, and we could use some of that revenue to fund things like roads and bridges and public transportation. When I spoke with some Pittsburgh-based transit advocates, they're like, "Hey, yes, we're happy to get some more money or another funding stream to get people around to work and to school, but something that could be hard to guess how much is coming in from, something like the vice of gambling, or whether that, or who that actually ends up targeting in these corner stores, vape shops, like you guys mentioned, would then they be paying for transit that they themselves need to use to get around. So I'm not sure if there will be a good horse to hitch that wagon to get it through. Like Dennis said, it might really come down to meeting between that 16 or 13 to 50 something number. And I think Shapiro said every dollar that goes into the machines is taking away from the lottery, which Dennis also mentioned is like a huge booster for the seniors in Pennsylvania. So everyone wants a piece of people gambling, not surprisingly, as so much money is going into it.
Now, Tom,
I'll mention, Tom makes a really good point. So Senate Republicans specifically have tied this issue to transit. And it's a pressing need. The state's, money that they put into transit, a lot of folks have said it's not high enough. SEPTA, specifically, the kind of massive transit system in Philadelphia and the surrounding suburbs, is approaching sort of a fiscal cliff, and they have said they're going to do significant cutbacks to service and raise fares if they don't get some help. And so, that's a large area of the state, and it is a priority, at least of the lawmakers who are in that area, to make sure that doesn't happen. And so skill games, as Tom said, have been one of the solutions floated. Republicans have essentially demanded a steady stream of revenue to pay for that sort of new piece of funding for transit. And it could be sort of a stick that gets them a little bit closer to making this law. But again, as we said, there's a lot of political complication there.
We should note one of the big issues is mass transit funding in general. SEPTA in Philadelphia specifically, they're in a financial crisis. Governor did take some money and transfer some money to help them, but they do need some kind of a funding form and some kind of funding stream. The governor in his budget is proposing actually increasing the amount of sales tax dollars that go to mass transit. It would turn out to be about $300 million additional. That's what he has proposed. Give more money from the sales taxes that the state takes in and steer that to mass transit.
Katie, maybe you can tell us, what is SEPTA's history of dealing with their own problems?
So, yeah, I mean, I guess SEPTA is, again, a massive system. They take in money from a lot of different sources. The city pays for some of it. The surrounding collar counties, which tend to be wealthier, so Montgomery County, Chester County, Delaware County, Bucks County. And then they get a certain amount of money from the state. And they are in the same boat as a lot of big transit agencies. During the pandemic, ridership went way down. And that was backstopped by a lot of federal dollars that went into public transit to try to save it, essentially. That money has now ended, and ridership took a while to bounce back. And so there was this, as I said before, fiscal cliff that they kind of hit where they needed more revenue very quickly. And so I'm not the right person to talk about the entire history of SEPTA and its funding, but that's roughly where it stands right now. And they've put out a pretty detailed proposal about how they're going to cut service, how they're going to cut costs. I would say, it's a little bit of a, political warning. People know that they don't want to do this. But they're saying, these are real risks. We are going to need to kind of batten down the hatches here if we're going to survive as an agency. And a lot of people use SEPTA. I mean, I live in Philadelphia, so I can kind of attest to that. But I should also say this isn't just SEPTA. The funding issues that transit has faced, there are a lot of smaller systems that are facing similar issues. The Pittsburgh system as well, systems that are in central Pennsylvania, bus systems. It's not just a problem that's isolated to big systems.
Well, Dennis, what I'm getting at is that some lawmakers don't have faith in SEPTA's management.
They do not, and there is mistrust on this issue. Full disclosure, I rode SEPTA to college every day. Went to LaSalle in Philadelphia and took the subway many times to Phillies and or Eagles games. Go Birds this weekend, by the way. That's the most important thing I'm going to say all this entire program as they're in the Super Bowl. But yes, there's mistrust. Rural Republicans, whenever the words mass transit come up, even though there are mass transit systems all around the state, they immediately see that as a boondoggle and money going to Philadelphia. But with America 250 coming in a year, as the governor has pointed out, there's going to be a lot of eyes and a lot of people focused on Pennsylvania and Philadelphia. There's a lot of great events coming. There needs to be that infrastructure there. And it is a benefit to everybody that not everybody has to drive into the city of Philadelphia all the time, that you can get in and out of there with a world-class public transit system. But politically, there's a lot of mistrust around the state. And that's why it's going to be very interesting that a Republican won a state Senate seat in Philadelphia. Joe Picozzi. It's going to be interesting to see how he handles that mistrust in his own caucus, because he's a Republican in Philadelphia, and balances that with the needs of his own city.
Tom, public transit was a big priority for the governor last year, but lawmakers didn't buy into it. Why?
I think a lot of Republicans and maybe even some Democrats in more rural districts have talked about public transit in shorthand as just SEPTA funding, it being the largest in the state. And Pittsburgh, they're a lot smaller. I think when I spoke with some people, or even Kim Ward after the budget address said, like, hey, Shapiro's robbing our roads and bridges, which a lot of public transit needs to use to get around in order just to fund SEPTA. And a lot of people, I think, do think of it as this like southeastern funnel that's only going that way. A few lawmakers told me, though, every county gets public transportation funds. Some of those could be seniors, like rides to doctors and things like that. Just thinking, I grew up in York County. I know Red Rabbit has like smaller buses that get around. People might not think of that as the public transit of SEPTA or Pittsburgh Regional Transit. But regardless, I think the infrastructure ties, whether that's roads, bridges, PennDOT money, and public transit, in Senate Republicans, at least this week, said those things need to be tied together. We're not going to get behind anything for public transit.
Katie, here's another aspect of the state budget. The governor plans to target carbon emissions from power plants, and there's been controversy along those lines. There was a federal plan that endeavored to do that, got tied up in court. Now Governor Shapiro has his own idea for paying for carbon emissions.
Yeah, so this was part, this is not a new proposal. He was working on this last year as well. He's tied it into this new sort of sweeping energy plan that he unveiled a little bit before the budget. He's calling it the Lightning Plan. But yeah, this is kind of a recurring issue for the legislature. Essentially, Republicans have long wanted to get out of the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, and Shapiro is kind of holding this up as an opportunity for us to do that. It basically caps carbon emissions from producers and then pumps the money back into the state. Under RGGI, it would go into a fund that pays for like environmental efforts. Shapiro is making the case that he could, if we have our own version of that plan that's like just state-based, we could use the money, we would have more jurisdiction over it. And so it could go into, for instance, lowering electricity costs, things like that. It has so far been a non-starter from Republicans. He's trying to kind of tie it into other proposals. So one of them would be, for instance, raising clean energy standards. And then there's also things that Republicans really want, like permitting reform, things like that, site development. That would, I should just say, like, not necessarily be part of the budget. It's one of these big bills that would likely get negotiated alongside the budget, and you horse trade various pieces of it. There are financial components too, but this is just it's kind of a related but separate thing that lawmakers are going to have to talk about. Last year, again, a lot of this was already introduced in concept and didn't really get much of anywhere. So we'll see where it goes this year.
All right, thank you, Katie. Let's try to fit in one more story. We only have a couple minutes left. It has nothing to do with the budget, Dennis, so adjust your brain that way. Because I want to talk
We're going to
about...
talk Eagles?
Close. You wish we would. We're going to talk about the Attorney General and the consumer advocate, the state consumer advocate, Patrick Cicero, resigned his job. And we only have a couple minutes left. First, tell us what kind of work that office does anyway.
The consumer advocates fights in front of the PUC on behalf of ratepayers in various utility issues. And they're supposed to be sticking up for the people that have to pay the bill. And Patrick Cicero was the guy, and the Attorney General gets to appoint, and they have to be confirmed by the Senate. Well, Dave Sunday is the incoming new Attorney General, and Cicero was appointed by Democrat Josh Shapiro. It is perfectly within his purview. He offered Mr. Cicero the chance to reapply for his job, but said, I'm going to look for other people. Cicero resigned, said that's not really good, and I'm really being squeezed out. And he raised a red flag saying, Dave Sunday, many of the contributors to his campaign were the utility companies that don't like that I'm fighting so hard on behalf of ratepayers. So that was basically that little fight. But again, it is within Sunday's purview, and he has since named an interim that will then have to be confirmed by the Senate.
Now, interestingly, the former PUC chair, Jim Cawley, he said very simply, succinctly, the for-profit companies wanted Cicero out.
That's what he said, and he said those for-profit companies contributed to Dave Sunday, and then Dave Sunday is doing their bidding. That's the allegation. But again, and I asked Josh Shapiro, who was the guy that appointed Cicero,
right?
And his response was, Dave Sunday's the Attorney General. He has a right to appoint who he wants to appoint.
All right, that's all the time we have today. Our guests have been Dennis Owens.
Go Eagles.
From WHTM ABC 27 in Harrisburg. Tom Riese, suddenly sporting his Eagles gear.
Nice.
From WESA. And Katie Meyer from Spotlight PA. Thanks, everyone. That is it for Journalist Roundtable. I'm Larry Casper. Thanks for watching.